Coming to you from a cozy little condo high atop Old 4th Ward, Atlanta. Welcome to The Ron Show on America One Radio. Here's your host, Ron Roberts.
I tell anyone who will engage in this conversation with me from an ideological alternate perspective, I'll say. Someone who is conservative, someone who is anti-immigration. I say all the time, if you don't like cats on your front porch, why on earth would you allow anyone to leave kibble out? See, when I say that, what I mean is, why are you punishing the cat or kitten for coming to where the food is? This is sort of the mindset that I have when I have these debates with folks about immigration, particularly on the right, because they seem to want to make a show, and we've seen this of late, a show of detention and enforcement. Sheriff Joe Arpaio, remember him in Arizona with the prison camps in the 120-degree heat. We want to criminalize and demonize the person who is risking their life to come here, also fleeing whatever violence or danger or economic depravity, political instability, climate change, in their home country to come work in this country. What we never do is take any sort of swift action. We never see the right make a show of the real illegals in my mind. And that's the illegal employer, the human trafficker. Check this out from NBC News just a couple of years ago.
The group in Georgia accused of creating a modern-day slavery operation charged with luring migrants from Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras with temporary visas and then making them work for pennies. 2 workers dying after allegedly being forced to work in harsh conditions. NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard tonight with the latest on that investigation.
Prosecutors calling it modern-day slavery in the fields of southern Georgia. Years worth of damning, horrific allegations. A new 54-page indictment by the U.S. Department of Justice, charging 24 individuals as part of what it calls Operation Blooming Onion. Prosecutors say the defendants defrauded the U.S.'s H-2A guest farm worker visa program. When many of those would-be farm workers arrived to the U.S., the indictment alleges they were abused and exploited.
A group of people in the U.S. has sold the American dream, kept them in deplorable conditions, held their documents, forced them to work for little or no pay, and systematically abused them.
All at the hands of what the DOJ is calling a transnational criminal organization, referred to as Patricio TCO, in operation since at least 2015. Victims allegedly forced to live in cramped, dirty trailers with raw sewage leaking into the trailers, threatened them with deportation, and detained them in a work camp surrounded by an electric fence. And in 2018, 30 individuals allegedly sold to another man in Indiana for $21,481.
What makes these H-2A workers susceptible to abuse?
They depend on the employer for their transportation, their food, their housing, their wages, whether they go to get medical help. The workers cannot complain because if they complain, they'll lose their jobs.
The acting U.S. attorney for the Southern District of Georgia, David Estes, stating, Operation Blooming Onion frees more than 100 individuals from the shackles of modern-day slavery and will hold accountable those who put them in chains. In addition to the charges, grim allegations. One individual, identified as victim number 12, repeatedly raped by a member of the criminal ring. But in 2019, one worker allegedly died from a heat stroke when he was outside working in the fields. And in 2020, another worker allegedly died when he was cleaning a Patricio TCO labor camp that did not have air conditioning.
If people treated pets this way, we'd all be outraged. Left, right, independent, nonpartisan, we'd all be outraged. Human beings, though? Well, are they here legally or illegally?
This indictment documents 66 victims, but the U.S. Attorney's Office says they are looking to account for more.
How critical are these workers for Georgia's economy?
Last year, we came in at just over 27,000 H-2A workers. in Georgia, the obligation an employer has to an H-2A worker is no different than they have to a domestic worker.
That is the voice of Chris Butts, the executive vice president for the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association.
An NBC News investigations team last year visited more than a dozen H-2A sites, including in Georgia,
No hubo paga para nosotros,
where violations were found to be prevalent. The Department of Labor in 2019 documenting about 12,000 violations by employers across the country under the H-2A visa program. This man, not related to Operation Blooming Onion, sharing his story.
That house where we lived, it was very old. It had spiders, cockroaches. The bathrooms didn't work. The house was gross. It was very dirty.
The conditions and the things that were described in these indictments are not surprising to us, not unusual.
So is it a matter of whether the U.S. puts the resources behind to go in and investigate and charge for these types of conditions?
It is. It is whether the U.S. government puts money and effort into checking workplace sites and really making sure that H-2A guest workers are taken care of and not exploited.
Breaking new development, an Arizona Republican has introduced a bill to abolish the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. This is part of a long-running Republican effort to abolish OSHA. And in the first Trump term, he reduced OSHA inspector headcounts to a historic low. And that had predictable and tragic results for worker safety. So while bills to abolish OSHA are not new, Republicans are now in a position to actually pull it off. They control the House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, and the presidency. Justice Clarence Thomas has already said that if a challenge to OSHA comes on his desk, he will vote to abolish it. This is extremely dangerous for American workers. It is reckless policy. If it goes through, it will be up to the states to enforce workplace safety.
That is attorney Ryan Steiger. By the way, good news, Georgia. A bipartisan group of Georgia state lawmakers, according to WSB-TV, filed legislation to authorize the Labor Department to create a guest worker program to bring qualified immigrants to work in areas that have labor shortages, which would be just about anywhere where agriculture is a mainstay in that local economy. Remember how I started this conversation, though? The discussion about leaving kibble on the front porch and getting mad that cats show up. We don't do a very good job of enforcing laws that make it scary to break those laws for the next person caught doing it. And this is a prime example. Lataro Greenspan, is the reporter reporting on this from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, a central figure in the sprawling Georgia human trafficking case that you just heard about from NBC News, has been sentenced. Lataro writing, in October 2021, a grand jury indicted 24 people for orchestrating a human trafficking scheme that federal prosecutors said trapped Georgia farm workers in brutal conditions akin to modern-day slavery. Dubbed Operation Blooming Onion, the scheme yielded one of the country's largest human trafficking and visa fraud investigations, according to the Department of Justice. Monday, the central figure in the case, 63-year-old Maria Patricio, was sentenced to 12 months and 1 day, 366 days in prison. According to the Savannah Morning News, coverage of a court hearing held at the Waycross Federal Courthouse. Patricio must also pay $314,369 in restitution to multiple victims. I don't know if that includes the family of those who died in those work conditions or not. Let's read further. According to farm worker advocates, Operation Blooming Onion shed light on a pattern of worker abuse that they say is pervasive across the Southeast, where foreign guest workers are a vital but vulnerable part of the agricultural industry. Federal prosecutors say defendants engaged in forced labor, coercing immigrants to work under the threat of gun violence, and sometimes dig for onions with their bare hands. When not in the fields, the workers were allegedly detained in work camps surrounded by electric fencing or held in cramped living quarters, including dirty trailers with raw sewage leaks and little access to food or safe drinking water. To prevent escapes, Lataro writes, federal prosecutors say that members of the accused ring confiscated guest workers' passports and documents. 2 workers died on the job, according to the indictment. Court records say 5 workers were kidnapped and 1 was raped, according to the Savannah Morning News. The bulk of the Operation Blooming Onion defendants, including Patricio, worked as farm labor contractors or middlemen, enlisted by farmers to recruit and manage their field laborers. Contractors found the wanted workers through the H-2A visa program, which has been booming in Georgia as domestic sources of labor dried up. The H-2A program allows foreign guest workers, most of whom hail from Mexico or Central America, to legally come to the U.S. for months at a time to work in agriculture. But because workers' legal status is contingent on their remaining under the employment of the party that sponsored their visa, labor advocates say the program is ripe for exploitation. The article continues, last fiscal year, a high of 43,436 workers crossed the border to legally work in the state, according to federal data. That's up from around 10,000 just 10 years ago. Georgia currently the second biggest user of the H-2A program nationwide, trailing only Florida. The same Florida that Ron DeSantis, as governor, has been attacking workplace condition laws that would penalize businesses and employers for working people in extreme heat. This is The Ron Show, America One Radio, progressive voices via TuneIn. Show notes provided, as always, at ronshowatl.com, including this from Timothy Noah, a little less than a year ago from the New Republic. Republicans finally recognize the threat posed by climate change. The threat is that rising temperatures will tempt local governments to impose regulations to mitigate the health effects of extreme heat. The state of Florida moved last week to nip that in the bud. Florida is a very hot place, Timothy writes. Indeed, it's the single hottest state. Hotter even than Hawaii and Arizona, according to a research team at Payless Power, a Texas utility company. Like every place else, Florida only gets hotter. Since 2009, the average Florida temperature rose from 73.1 degrees to 76.3 degrees. That was bound to provoke labor agitation, and it did. A worker advocacy group in South Florida called We Count initiated a campaign to require that agricultural and other outdoor workers, many of them undocumented immigrants, be provided sufficient water, shade, and rest. In response, Miami-Dade County introduced an ordinance creating a heat standard for outdoor workers. The bill raised objections from the Miami-Dade Farm Bureau, which represents growers. Farming is hard enough as it is, protested the executive director, Jocelyn Guilfoyle. The last thing we need is to be subject to the Miami-Dade heat police. Because this is something to make light of. To mollify the growers, the county commission agreed to raise the temperature threshold, triggering a requirement that employers give their workers water and break periods. It had been 90 degrees. The commission raised that to 95 degrees. The commission also lowered the maximum fine from $3,000 to $2,000. That didn't satisfy Florida's Republican-controlled state government. For once, the impetus to pass a reactionary law did not come from Governor Ron DeSantis, perhaps because he's no longer running for president. Rather, it came from the state legislature, where Republicans hold a supermajority. The bill's sponsor in the Florida House, Tiffany Esposito, said at a hearing for the legislation that, quote, if you want to talk about health and wellness, and you want to talk about how we can make sure that all Floridians are healthy, you do that by making sure that they have a good job. And in order to provide a good job, we need to not put businesses out of business. Even, I guess, if it means you have to walk over a carcass in the field. Because Florida is a part-time legislature, Esposito did not give up her job when she entered state government. That job is president of SWFL.Inc., a regional chamber of commerce for South Florida. Esposito's legislation is therefore a giveaway to a business lobby of which Esposito is herself a member. The bill cleared Florida's House and Senate March 8th. DeSantis made sure reporters knew the bill wasn't his idea, but he signed it nonetheless. Now, last summer, the Occupational Safety and Health Association, or OSHA, worked in conjunction with the U.S. Department of Labor on a new rule that requires employers to develop injury and illness prevention plans in order to better protect workers from heat-related injuries and death. This from NPR. Workers all over the country are passing out, suffering heat stroke and dying from heat exposure from just doing their jobs, and something must be done to protect them. That's Doug Parker, Assistant Secretary for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, then anyway. In a statement to the media. Today's proposal is an important next step in the process to receive public input to craft a win-win final rule that protects workers while being practical and workable for employers. The NPRP states heat is the leading cause of weather-related deaths in the United States, killing more than 200 people last year. The department said that new regulations would provide protection for some 36 million workers nationwide, particularly people of color, who are more likely to work in roles that could expose them to extreme heat. The proposed rule comes as the nation continues to experience record-shattering heat waves and extreme weather activity, and as more than 75 million people were under heat alerts just the day this story came out. 2023, the hottest year on record. 2024 eclipsed it. Since global temperatures began being documented in 1850, heat-related deaths have climbed over the past few years as the globe continues to grapple with more extreme weather conditions, and scientific consensus says climate change brought on by human activity is to blame. This is where conservatives tune out. Oh my God, here they go again with the climate change lie. This is where I take you back to the Patricio figurehead in the Operation Blooming Onion human trafficking scheme, getting 12 months and 1 day sentencing. Back to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution article. According to a statement from the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Georgia, charges thus far have been resolved against 17 of the Operation Blooming Onion defendants. Charges or resolutions are pending against 7. Patricio's sentencing comes more than 6 months after she pled guilty to conspiracy to commit mail fraud for her role in worker exploitations. In the hearing, Patricio's defense attorney requested probation. She noted that the case was not emblematic of Patricio's character and that Patricio provided assistance to the government in its investigation, according to the Savannah Morning News. Countering that argument, attorney Tanya Groove said Patricio should be humiliated and ashamed for her role in the case. Patricio filed 15 petitions with the government to bring H-2A workers to Georgia, which led to 42 people being harmed. But she received a shorter sentence than other co-defendants because she had less direct, harmful contact with the farm workers. No victims testified at the sentencing hearing, the Savannah Morning News reports, with many workers having migrated back to their home countries or declining to speak. For some farm worker advocates, Patricio's sentencing does not represent the victory they'd hoped it would be. This short sentence, significantly less than the years-long Operations Blooming Onion investigation itself, is an insult to the hundreds of workers who were trafficked and exploited in conditions prosecutors called modern-day slavery. Those are the words of Teresa Romero, president of the United Farm Workers, in a statement. She noted the judge who sentenced Patricio, U.S. District Court Judge Lisa Godbey Wood, is the same judge who blocked new protections for H-2A farm workers created by the administration of President Joe Biden from going into effect last year. Individuals engaged in human trafficking use legal guest worker programs like the uncapped H-2A visa program must be severely punished. While the program is clearly in desperate need of accountability, oversight, and reform, this abuse must be prevented from ever happening again, Romero said in her statement. And I don't think nothing is being done to protect workers in the fields. Back to the New Republic article. In the absence of federal action, various localities and even some states, California, Washington, Colorado, Minnesota, and Oregon, have moved to regulate workers' heat exposure. But after Dallas and Austin imposed their own municipal heat exposure rules, the Republican-controlled Texas state legislature, predictably, moved to thwart these efforts by passing HB 2127. Governor Greg Abbott signed it into law last June during a heat wave, of course. Like DeSantis, Abbott showed a disinclination to take credit. Such reticence makes the author of this piece, The New Republic, wonder whether GOP-mandated heat stroke could be a potent political issue for Democrats. Well, he writes this last summer, this fall. As Florida did last week, Texas barred local governments from imposing regulations to limit heat exposure, making the same, quote, patchwork of regulations argument. Even though Texas, like Florida, has no statewide regulation on heat exposure and no intention of creating one. Texas is not the hottest state. It doesn't even crack Payless Power's top 3, but it does enjoy the distinction of killing the most workers from heat exposure, according to the Texas Tribune, at least for the years 2011 to 2022. Its passage of HB 2127, which took effect in September, will presumably help it keep the title. Timothy Noah in the New Republic continues. At bottom, neither the Republicans in Texas nor the Republicans in Florida really object to local governments poaching on state responsibilities. As Jordan Borah, author of the indispensable Confined Space blog on worker safety, pointed out, the preamble to Florida's law gives the game away. Local regulation of heat exposure, it said, would, quote, ignore the individual responsibility of an employee to follow relevant guidelines and to protect himself or herself from heat-related illnesses. If you die picking oranges from heat exposure, the state of Florida would like it to be your own goddamned fault. As always, I'll provide all of these links in the show notes at ronshowatl.com. Second half of the show, boy, Mitch McConnell's got a lot of chutzpah. He wrote an op-ed grousing about the cost of goods and services for his Kentuckians, his constituents, because of Donald Trump's tariffs. If only Mitch McConnell were ever at some point in time in a position to prevent his constituents and the rest of us in the United States, and of course around the world, from having to experience a second Donald Trump presidency. I just don't remember if there's ever a time he could have done something to have prevented that. We'll dive into that when the Ron Show returns on America One Radio, Progressive Voices via TuneIn.
Broadcasting 5 days a week to make common sense common again. This is The Ron Show on America One Radio.
Mitch McConnell has a lot of stones, man. I mean, I don't know that he does personally, but it takes a lot of gall to take to writing an op-ed complaining about the effects of a second Donald Trump presidency. That is exactly what Mitch McConnell did. Wow, right? I mean, you have to shake your head, right? This guy, really? Senator Mitch McConnell, the guy who was Senate Majority Leader at a key moment in time when an impeachment impeachment proceedings took place that could have removed Donald Trump from the office of presidency at that time and forever again. Mitch McConnell took to the Louisville Courier-Journal to write an op-ed. The headline, Kentuckians can't afford the high cost of Trump's tariffs. I'm not going to read the whole thing in his voice because that would take a lot, and you would honestly get sick of hearing it. Maybe you're sick of hearing my voice too. So be it. You're still here. Thank you. He writes, in Kentucky, local store owners are already hearing about their suppliers' prices going up. One estimate suggests President Trump's tariffs could cost the average Kentuckians up to $1,200 each year. This written by the opinion contributor, Mitch McConnell, and arriving in yesterday's Louisville Courier-Journal. He writes, little under a century ago, he should know, an ill-fated law helped spiral the Wall Street crash of 1929 into a worldwide depression. The Smoot-Hawley tariff encompassed roughly 1/4 of all imports, he writes, flaring tensions with U.S. trading partners and cutting in half, American imports and exports as a result. Caught in the crosshairs, Americans learned the hard way that trade wars are expensive, and today we ought to be careful deciding with whom to pick them. Careful? Does Trump know the word careful or what it means? In recent weeks, the president sought to impose sweeping tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China, as well as key imports such as steel and aluminum. While the administration walked back plans to levy 25% duties on imports from Mexico and Canada, paused now for 30 days as both nations brokered deals to tighten border security and crack down on illegal drugs. Yeah, Canada. Border security and illegal drugs. Wink, wink. The president's aggressive proposals leave big, lingering concerns for American industry and workers. Y'all, this is Mitch McConnell, former Senate Majority Leader, Republican Party, senator from Kentucky. Indeed, he writes, it's high time for America's closest neighbors to take the crisis at our border seriously. Boy, if only there were some sort of bipartisan bill that about a year ago could have been passed if someone in, a Senate majority role had had the courage to offer. Wait a minute, I believe his name was Mitch McConnell. He writes, but no matter our best intentions, oh please, tariffs are bad policy. As Senator Rand Paul put it, another Kentucky senator. Tariffs are simply taxes. Taxing trade will mean less trade and higher prices. So Republicans ought to be clear-eyed about the full, unadulterated impact of tariffs, Mitch McConnell writes, as we work to restore sound fiscal policy to our government. Blanket tariffs make it more expensive to do business in America, driving up costs for consumers across the board. Boy, where was all of this conversation during the election season? These aren't just abstract concerns, McConnell writes. broad-based tariffs could have long-term consequences right in our backyard. Consider our state's 75,000 family farms that sell their crops around the globe. I wonder, do they use the H-2A visa program there as well? Or the hardworking Kentuckians who craft 95% of the world's bourbon? Or our auto industry, he writes, that relies on global supply chains to support the livelihoods of thousands of workers in the Commonwealth? Well, maybe there's a Tesla plant in Kentucky that could step in and fill the void, because obviously Tesla is going to get the carve out, remember? McConnell continues. In Kentucky, local store owners are already hearing about their suppliers' prices going up. One estimate suggests the president's tariffs could cost the average Kentuckian up to $1,200 each year. And it's not just about rising prices here at home. During the last Trump administration, retaliatory tariffs from trade partners set off a broader trade war that hit wide swaths of American industry, from agriculture to manufacturing to aerospace and motor vehicles to distilled spirits. Where was this Mitch McConnell 5 years ago when this was happening? Already, Canada announced retaliatory measures that take direct aim at Kentucky production, targeting products like peanut butter, and whiskey. We all know, of course, British Columbia said no more American liquor on the shelves. Hundreds of thousands of U.S. jobs are tied up, directly or indirectly, in trade with Canada and Mexico. Mitch McConnell, I remind you, writes, our neighbors to the north and south buy over $500 billion worth of our goods and services each year, including nearly $10 billion in manufactured goods and $300 million in agricultural exports from Kentucky alone. These economic tailwinds could touch virtually every family and every industry. Sorry, I needed to do a Mitch McConnell blackout. No, I misread. Too soon? Insensitive? America's open markets, Mitch McConnell, former Senate Majority Leader from Kentucky, writes, also fuel billions in capital investment from businesses abroad. In Kentucky, over 60% of all counties are home to at least one international business. These are industrial suppliers, auto manufacturers, and makers of consumer goods from across the world that support roughly 100,000 jobs in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. But these investments, Mitch McConnell writes, don't happen on their own. Foreign businesses choose America because they can count on our commitment to free markets and free enterprise. Sudden shifts in protectionism undermine the certainty these companies rely on to do business in the United States. When we engage with our allies and partners, McConnell writes, we unlock new sources of economic strength, lower prices, more choices for consumers, and greater innovation. And we ought to remind ourselves, Mitch McConnell writes, that trade is a two-way street. That's rich. Take our work on the USMCA under the first Trump administration. That landmark deal with Canada and Mexico leveled the playing field. That is the one that Donald Trump, by the way, complained, who the hell made that deal? It was him. Level the playing field for American workers, reduced the incentives to ship American jobs to Mexico, and expanded American producers' access to sell goods to these neighboring markets, including Kentucky-made products like bourbon. Boy, he loves the liquor from Kentucky. Kentucky-made bourbon, cars, aerospace parts, and agricultural commodities. By the way, let me just point out, when we level the playing field for American workers, reducing the incentives to ship American jobs to Mexico, understand that when you don't have jobs in Mexico and people in Mexico want jobs, where do they go? They go where the jobs are. Yeah. Don't get me wrong, NAFTA was a flawed law, but NAFTA was trying to correct some of the immigration woes as well that Republicans now complain about. They're literally the kid in the meme poking the stick in the bike of the front wheel, the spoke of the front wheel of the bike, and then complaining about the crash. Every time I have to bring that up, I just giggle because the meme is hilarious. McConnell continues in yesterday's Louisville Courier Journal, hard to say, with his op-ed. That doesn't mean the system is perfect. For the adversaries coordinating to threaten America's security and undermine our interests, economic predation is a weapon. And holding China and other anti-competitive countries accountable for predatory practices that abuse our system should be absolutely an urgent priority. We should continue to push back against unfair competition and shore up critical supply chains, he writes. But preserving the long-term prosperity of American industry and workers requires working with our allies, not against them. Does Donald Trump like working with our allies? He likes phoning with Putin. He likes love letters to Kim Jong-un. Allies? Trade wars with our partners hurt working people most, McConnell writes. And the president has better tools to protect American workers without forcing our families and businesses to absorb higher costs. As the president and Republicans work to undo the damage of the last 4 years, McConnell unironically says, we ought to strengthen our friendships abroad and reinforce our allies as pillars of American prosperity and security. At a time when Americans are tightening their belts, we would do well to avoid policies that heap on the pain. That is former Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell in an open op-ed in the Louisville Courier-Journal. There, I said it. Got it right. Appearing yesterday. I'll have that in the show notes at ronshowatl.com. Mitch McConnell, the guy who had an opportunity to present articles of impeachment passed by the House twice, both on solid footing, twice. And more importantly, had the opportunity to do so in the final days of the first Trump presidency to prevent a second Trump presidency from ever coming to be. Mitch McConnell around. Mitch McConnell found out. I'm going to take you now to a piece in Alternate that refers to a piece that was written in The Atlantic. In a Sunday, October 27th article published by The Atlantic and adapted from journalist Michael Tackett's new book, The Price of Power, Tackett lays out what he believes was, quote, likely the worst political miscalculation of Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's career. The Republican leader's, quote, goal was to preserve a Senate majority, Tackett writes. McConnell, quote, wanted the energy of Trump voters in Senate races without the baggage of Trump. He gambled on his belief that Trump would fade from the political stage in the aftermath of January 6th. Quote, instead, Trump reemerged every bit as strong among core supporters. The deputy Washington bureau chief for the Associated Press explained how McConnell fumbled a law that could help prevent future insurrections. Writing, calls quickly came to investigate the cause of the riot. Polls showed that a majority of Americans supported an inquiry. The House passed bipartisan legislation to create a commission modeled after the one that had examined the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. A body that would include an equal number of Democrats and Republicans. 35 Republicans in the House joined Democrats to support the measure. Then the legislation went to the Senate and McConnell pivoted. Congressional committee, he said, were capable of conducting the investigation, and the commission was largely a Democratic ploy to, quote, relitigate that day and Trump's role in it. So on May 28th, less than 6 months after his own life had been jeopardized during the riot, he blocked perhaps the nation's best chance of getting a full accounting of what had happened. Furthermore, Tackett notes, more striking was how McConnell approached another potential remedy to deal with Trump, a second impeachment. This is The Ron Show on America One Radio, Progressive Voices via TuneIn or wherever you podcast. I know it's a lot today, right? Good news, we're in the home stretch. Final segment here. Thank you so much for listening. So we're talking a little bit about Mitch McConnell and, woe is Mitch, and Kentucky voters who have had numerous opportunities to elect someone other than Mitch McConnell or Rand Paul to serve them in the U.S. Senate. Of course, the House of Representatives being what it is. They do have a Democratic governor, Andy Beshear, who some still believe is a rising star and could be the answer to Democrats' woes when it comes to dealing with flyover states and rural voters, et cetera, and so on. Mitch McConnell has had many opportunities to rid the nation and the world of the scourge of Trumpism and the MAGA movement. But let me go back to this piece in Alternate that spoke to exactly why Mitch McConnell blinked. Mitch McConnell wanted to preserve a Senate majority. The goal was to preserve a Senate majority, Tackett writes. McConnell, quote, wanted the energy of Trump's voters in Senate races without the baggage of Trump. That sums up essentially the lack of courage that the Republican Party has had with facing Donald Trump all this time for the last, 12, 15 years or so that he has been essentially a boil on the butt of American politics. So instead, as you heard me say just a few minutes ago in the Alternate piece, Tackett writes, Trump reemerged every bit as strong among core supporters. McConnell had the chance, of course, with the first impeachment. Russia, the Russia hoax. To impeach Donald Trump then. Mitch McConnell had the opportunity to participate in a fully bipartisan January 6th commission and balked. And then, of course, the second impeachment after January 6th, when America's appetite for justice on that day, from that day, was healthy. While, quote, Democrats pushed to impeach Trump and the House moved quickly to do so, no one really knew which way the Kentucky lawmaker would go, Tackett writes. I wish he would have voted to convict Donald Trump, and I think he was convinced that he was entirely guilty. Tackett says those are the words of one Mitt Romney, Republican senator from Utah, emphasizing that McConnell thought convicting someone no longer in office was a bad precedent. The Utah senator told Tackett that, quote, he viewed McConnell's political calculation as being, quote, that Donald Trump was no longer going to be on the political stage, that Donald Trump was finished politically. Mitch McConnell miscalculated badly. And the thing that gets me is, how can someone who has survived in politics as long as Mitch McConnell has misread the room so badly? I don't know if you saw it a couple Sundays ago, the puff piece, the cleanup, the attempted cleanup of the Mitch McConnell legacy that occurred on 60 Minutes. But, oh man, what an attempt it was. And I just watched it seething the entire time. Like, this guy is the single greatest reason why our democracy is impaled right now, other than Donald Trump.
After 18 years as the longest-serving Senate leader ever, Mitch McConnell is starting the year as a backbencher. At 82, he's thinking about his legacy. He recently cooperated on a book about his life, relinquishing his personal papers to the biographer. After voting against Pete Hegseth for defense secretary, the question is, how much more will McConnell defy President Donald Trump? Everybody wants to know. What will Mitch do?
You have said that you feel liberated, like Martin Luther King, free at last.
Really?
Yeah.
So,
well, I
free for what? Free to do what?
Well, I will be more outspoken about things that I particularly care about than I have been in the past.
Particularly the resurgence of isolationism in today's Republican Party.
America first, that's what they used in the 30s. And I'm hopeful the new administration will understand and act, not with just language that says America first, but funding that underscores the nature of the threat. Look, what is the situation? North Korea, China, Russia, Iran. This is a huge threat, a fight between the autocrats and the democracy.
We're not a democracy.
And when it comes to the democratic world, only one country can lead. That's us.
That's fundamental to the difference between what you're saying and what this administration seems to be saying, which is we don't want to be the leader of the free world anymore.
Well, I can only speak for myself. I think it's dangerous to step aside and assume that by speaking to autocrats, they will somehow treat you better.
What about tariffs?
Well, he wrote about that.
Against our allies.
It will drive the cost of everything up. In other words, it'll be paid for by American consumers. I mean, why would you want to get in a fight with your allies over this?
What about the encroachment on the independence of the Senate, for example? Will you be speaking out about that?
I sure will. When I was majority leader and he was president, he tried to get me to change the filibuster.
Right.
I said I had a one-word answer, no.
In the book, it says that you had a couple of screaming matches on the phone with the president.
We had a candid relationship, you know.
The Trump-McConnell feud has been roiling for a long time.
We do have to do something about Mitch McConnell. He's a disaster. He's a disaster.
President Trump called you, among other things, a sullen, unsmiling political hack. You have said some pretty harsh things about him. You've said he's nasty. You said he's not very smart. You said he's a sleazeball.
Well, those were private comments, and
well, but they're in your biography.
Yeah.
He vented about Donald Trump to his biographer, Michael Tackett, who interviewed him over the last 3 years.
What's the most courageous thing he did as leader?
The most courageous thing he did as leader was stand up for aid for Ukraine. It wasn't popular within his party. It wasn't popular with Donald Trump. It wasn't popular with J.D. Vance, but he did it anyway.
What's the most despicable thing he did?
Merrick Garland?
The most contentious thing he did was to block Merrick Garland, not simply from getting a vote in the Senate, but from even having a hearing in the Senate.
McConnell single-handedly blocked President Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court.
One of my proudest moments is when I looked at Barack Obama in the eye and I said, Mr. President, you will not fill this Supreme Court vacancy.
This was the first step in McConnell's engineering of a conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court.
What about the way you went about imposing these justices
I like that word.
into the system?
Imposing.
How do you feel as you look back on your legacy?
I feel fine about it. I knew that if the shoe was on the other foot,
But is that a good reason?
they would have done the same thing.
When had that
Your
happened?
biographer, and I'm quoting him, said it was a brutish exercise of power. Brutish.
I just don't agree.
I know, but what do you think about that sort of image of you?
I decided political popularity was not my motivation. I was going to try to help right of center America have a voice, and that was what I thought was the most important thing I could do.
Do you take any responsibility that the court has lost so much credibility?
You ought to.
There's been a recent poll that says 70% of the American people think that justices are more influenced by ideology than by being fair and impartial.
Yeah. The reason their popularity is down is because the Democrats are
The majority of the country.
criticizing them all the time.
Okay, but I'm not talking about popularity. I'm talking about credibility of a major institution.
But Leslie, their job is not to seek public approval. It's to follow the law.
The law said President Obama, the Constitution granted him the right to nominate a Supreme Court justice, and you blocked that. There were laws on the books that would allow you to seat a full bipartisan commission to investigate January 6th. There were laws on the books that granted you the ability to hold an impeachment inquiry that would have been fair and would have unseated Donald Trump, if not once, at least once, perhaps twice in his tenure. And you didn't follow the law, sir. You followed political ambition and political self-preservation. Mitch McConnell is singularly responsible for the reemergence of Donald Trump and all that will go wrong with this presidency that he now realizes is unfurling before his 82-year-old beady eyes. And for him to have the audacity, the temerity, the gall to take to the Louisville Courier-Journal, I have to slow down when I say it. That is a tough name to say. To complain about tariffs and how it's going to affect his constituency in Kentucky, to me is just rich. And I'm not going to sit here and stay silent and allow him to rewrite the narrative, his legacy, for what he'd like it to look like. Now he wants to be a responsible legislator and representative of his people of Kentucky, when for many years he worked against the best interests of the least among them within his home state. Kentucky, one of the poorest states in the country, one of the least educated states in the country, huge wealth gap. And yet, Kentucky, like many states, full of voters driven by animus for owning the libs, for demonizing immigrants, for taking postures. Remember the county clerk who took postures against gay marriage, the scourge of gay marriage, a decade ago? Mitch McConnell around, and we're all finding out together. That's going to do it today's Ron Show. We replay 5 p.m., weekdays 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. on America One Radio, 11 p.m. Progressive Voices via TuneIn, and of course, wherever you podcast. Show notes, as always, at RonShowATL.com. Have yourselves a great day.